Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'll bring you back a little closer to home. So my role is, I think, to give you a little bit the bird's eye view from Brussels, so to speak. So I will take you to a little presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. The idea is to start with more of a medium-term reflection on what European policy challenges are. And by Europe, I mean not just the EU, I would say European democracies. Then focus a little bit on the debate of last year in the context of various elections, particularly the elections to the European Parliament, on ideas that were floated on how to address these challenges. I will give you a slide on the Draghi report. I will then tell you how the European Commission has positioned itself on some of these challenges. And then I will end on a note on European defense. So one way of organizing the discussion is to talk in terms of three buckets of challenges. So there is growth, of course, where the baseline problem, I would say, since roughly the late 2000s has been relatively subdued productivity growth. So this is not true in all countries. Of course, emerging Europe has been catching up, has been quite fast, but it's true for most advanced European countries. The only country that has grown in line with the United States is Sweden, actually. They have roughly kept up. Everyone else has been slower. And we have had a demographic problem that compounds the productivity growth problem. Now, recently, this has gotten worse, mostly through two influences. One is the persistent effect of higher energy prices since the energy price crisis of 2022-23. And so, it has cut us off from Russian gas, and it has accelerated our transition to green energy. But even when we get through that transition, Europe will be relatively energy poor as a continent in terms of green energy because our green energy resources geographically are less good than in other regions of the world. And then, of course, the second big challenge for European competitiveness has been China, in a sense, replacing Germany as sort of the advanced manufacturing country and sort of threatening part of the manufacturing-intensive growth model in Europe. The second issue has been decarbonization. So this has become sort of number one in the European policy agenda, at least for the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. So the first von der Leyen Commission launched the European Green Deal with great enthusiasm. It was probably clear that already at the beginning that the ability of the green transition to stimulate growth was a little bit exaggerated, and that at least in the short term there would be trade-offs. These trade-offs have become increasingly apparent, partly because of these energy challenges and challenges due to China. But in addition, we have now less fiscal space following the COVID shock and the enormous deficits of their time, and less political space given fracturing of political opinions, a strengthening of the far right to actually pull decarbonization off. And on top of that, of course, very recently, we have a huge challenge in keeping decarbonization on track internationally, with the United States essentially withdrawing from emissions reduction, and not only in the US, but also from the willingness to support emissions reduction in the developing world financially, which the Biden administration probably would have done, or the Kamala Harris administration would have done. The third big challenge that you know well is security, and so we have a baseline problem, which is security dependence on the United States with Russia next door, and this was exacerbated by the much more acute Russian threat after the invasion of Ukraine, and a much weaker commitment, particularly since January 20th of this year. On top of that, we have a new set of more low-level economic security challenge, which is mostly a threat from China, through our very high import dependency on China, but it is potentially also a threat from the US, as we are starting to experience during these days. And so sitting over all these three themes is sort of a meta challenge, which is that we cannot really attain all these three objectives: growth, decarbonization, security at the same time, right? There's a trade-off, and the trade-off works through two channels. There's the short-term impact of decarbonization on growth. It makes business more expensive. But then, of course, it works through fiscal resources, right? We don't have money for everything. So how do we address the challenge? And so the Draghi report gave a solution, which can be put into 5 buckets for the purposes of this exposition. So one is just old-fashioned structural reform, reduction and reform of regulation, but particularly reforms of the single market. So to increase services mobility, labor mobility within the single market, but also to give a push to banking union and particularly to capital markets union, so that savings can be mobilized within Europe for the purposes of higher investment. The second bucket is what I would call just working together better at the EU level and probably delegating more decisions to the EU level. So this is about exploiting efficiency gains, for example, in coordinating investment with national policies, in having a budget in the EU that is really focused on public goods for the whole of Europe, having a common electricity market that could bring electricity prices down, a common research and innovation policy. So these are all things that are pushed by Draghi. The third is a massive investment push. So he wants an overall investment increase of 4.5% of GDP per year. So unbelievably big. Now, most of this, he says, should be privately financed, but if you say that about 1/5, as a rule of thumb, or a quarter is publicly financed, this is still a 1% of GDP increase in public investment. Why is this necessary? It's related to the single market agenda and to decarbonization. So this is about cross-border infrastructure, renewable energy sources, grids, digital, and so on. And then his fourth big bucket is industrial policy. So one way of thinking about the Draghi report is that it is a European version of what we started calling Bidenomics. So President Biden's economic policy, which is to aggressively promote decarbonization and industrialization into new technologies through subsidies, tax credits. And so Draghi has a version of that, focused on clean tech, but then he has a more defensive version of that, which is about essentially protecting traditional energy-intensive industry in Europe. He doesn't want to do this unconditionally, so the argument here is made in the context of decarbonization. He argues that these are hard-to-abate industries, that if we put the full burden of decarbonization on them, they will probably go out of business, that we cannot afford to lose them completely because they're essential to the EU industrial model, and that what we should be doing is to essentially subsidizing their decarbonization. So that is how he puts the argument. And finally, he argues for what he calls a foreign economic policy, which is mostly about reducing dependence from China. So let me give you a few reactions to these recommendations. So these reactions are kind of a combination of the vibe in Brussels and in some European capitals and our own views. So I think his first 3 points on the need for reform, for more EU collective action, and for high investment, this is basically widely accepted. How you finance this is not widely accepted, right? But the objectives are widely accepted. Now, the main issue is here political and fiscal feasibility, because many of the reforms have been tried before and they have not succeeded, largely because there is a reluctance to delegate more to the EU level. So the question is, what should be different now? Maybe the answer is we are in a much more urgent situation now. And as I said, there is a fiscal constraint now, which is particularly tight, which makes it very difficult to raise spending at the EU level. And the reason is that there is a trade-off between spending this money at the national and at the EU level. There is, at least superficially, a way out of that trade-off, which is to borrow at the EU level. But then, half of Europe is opposed to that. There is much less agreement, or even less agreement, on industrial policy. And so here there are essentially 2 issues. One is, how far should state intervention go? So the Draghi report was quite interventionist, He wanted to spend a lot of money in supporting and developing industry. And this is controversial, I believe, particularly with respect to energy-intensive industry. And the reason is that even if we were to succeed in decarbonizing energy-intensive industry, it would still be energy-intensive. So in an energy-poor continent, by and large energy-poor continent, this creates pressure on energy prices that are faced by everyone else, right? So there is sort of what economists would call an externality, a pecuniary externality through market prices from keeping as much as possible of energy-intensive industry in Europe, and this is a trade-off that is not addressed in the report. Another important question is how EU nationalist should industrial policy be? So the Biden brand of American industrial policy was very nationalist. It was based on manufacturing, of course, in the US, but also on the use of US-sourced inputs, so-called local content requirements. If you used US inputs, you got an extra subsidy, or it was a requirement to get a subsidy. Should we follow this path? And so, one reason not to follow this path is that it's actually prohibited by the World Trade Organization. So we have signed up to a system of rules that are supposed to limit economic nationalism worldwide, where it generates collectively worse outcomes, where it makes us and our trading partner collectively worse off. So the US threw this overboard, first with the Trump tariffs, then with the Biden subsidies. Should we follow that path? And Draghi basically says yes. I would say no. And the reason is that we are, at this point, the EU and the single market, the only remaining economic superpower in the world that still sticks to rules. And I think that this makes up a lot of our foreign policy appeal in the world. And so we do not want to use this model. But this is something that is really controversial because Draghi and myself, we agree on virtually everything. We slightly disagree on this point. You can also say that he is too narrow on the foreign economic policy. So there are some important dimensions that are missing. So international climate action is just not discussed at all in his report, probably because he thought this was not in scope. But it's still stunning if he's talking about let's build a foreign economic policy, that this is all about reducing dependence from China and not much else. And then, of course, there are some economic security threats that go beyond China that are not discussed. So this is particularly our financial dependency on the United States, which may now become an issue. And finally, there is, of course, no treatment of security proper. Now, that is not something he can be blamed for. He was supposed to write a report on European competitiveness, not on defense. But it's an important area that's outside the report. So what has the European Commission done with this? So the best way of describing it is that the European Commission is like low-cost Draghi. It's a low-cost version of Draghi, plus some defense. And so in more detail, what they do is they very closely follow Draghi's innovation, single market, and energy agenda, which is good. They also try to embrace this investment agenda, and particularly the industrial policy, which I'm not so sure about, as I just told you, but with two important caveats. The first is good, so they do not call openly for violating WTO commitments. But the other one is more problematic, which is that they assume tight fiscal constraints at the EU level. I mean, you can say this is just being pragmatic. What else should they do? But they do not make a case for a significant expansion of the EU budget, for EU-level borrowing, for all these things that are essential to the Draghi report. By the way, one reason why Draghi wants EU-level borrowing is that he believes that EU-level debt is important to get the capital markets union going as a safe asset to essentially substitute the reliance on national safe assets and create a genuine European capital market. And so this is a victim if you give up on that level. But the implication, if you still want to do industrial policy, if you still want to do investment, is that the money will have to come from member states, and that creates its own problems. And then, as I said, the Commission adds a common defense policy dimension. And so, to their credit, they have been very active since the invasion of Ukraine, and particularly, I would say, since last year, and again with the new commission that took office in December. So I've put some of their policies or elements on this bullet. So there's a sort of supply side, again, industrial policy for the defense sector in a way, which is mostly about access to finance for smaller companies in the defense sector, new entrants that's supported by some money, not huge money, but probably enough money. The European Investment Bank has expanded into supporting defense, which they previously were prohibited from doing through their own policies. There is a joint procurement push, so they have created a legal vehicle that's supposed to make that easier. And then the Commission, about 3 weeks ago, announced a set of new EU loans called SAFE, about 150 billion in total. And if you're a member state and you want access to those loans, you can do that to support common procurement. So you need to find a few partners that will procure with you. And then there's finally the fiscal issues. So how do they want to loosen fiscal constraints for defense, which of course is a huge topic. As the previous speaker explained in the Taiwanese context, it's also a big topic for us. And here the Commission doesn't have a whole lot to offer, but it has something to offer. One is the access to these relatively cheap loans. The other one is that it has relaxed the fiscal constraints which the EU fiscal rules impose on members for the purposes of defense spending. And so you can get about 1.5% of GDP in extra borrowing space relative to what the rules would otherwise dictate for the purposes of increasing military spending. Okay, how might this approach fall short? So, the first point, of course, because it is very closely related to the Draghi report, it inherits the strengths of the Draghi report, and for the most part, the Draghi report is very strong, but also some of the weaknesses, right? So it is a little unclear whether this big push for European collective action will work, given that it has been tried before. And there are these potentially unintended consequences of subsidies, particularly for energy-intensive industry. But the biggest constraint or problem of the Commission's approach compared to Draghi, so this is now where they differ, they have introduced a new problem that didn't exist in the Draghi report, is this reliance, almost exclusive reliance on member state money for industrial policy and investment. And so there are essentially two issues with that. The first one is illustrated by the two charts, which is it's really, really implausible that we're actually going to get this big investment push if we are simply going to tell member states to both increase investment and stick to the new fiscal rules, which require reducing the deficits, right? And so the bar chart shows you the level of public investment as a percent of GDP that was spent in 2024, and then it shows you three future projections of what will happen in the future. So the red bar to the left is what is in the fiscal plans that EU members have submitted to the Commission for the next 4 to 7 years in the fall. So this is part of the new exercise where, as part of the fiscal rules, you have to explain how you want to consolidate, in what time frame you want to do it, and your composition of spending. And so you can see that the red bar is not much higher than the blue bar. So there's like a difference of 0.2% of GDP. And what we need is at least 1% of GDP higher to be consistent with the Draghi vision. And then the two bars in the middle and at the right are the same exercise except based on projections rather than what countries themselves say. And if you ask yourself, well, why is this the case? Well, it's because countries are really struggling to reduce deficits. And so that point is illustrated in the bar in the chart on the right, which shows an inverse correlation between the degree of fiscal adjustment so the reduction in the deficit that countries have planned in the next 4 years, and the change in public investment as a share of GDP. So you see countries like Sweden up there, the Netherlands, these are the countries with fiscal space that are not planning any fiscal adjustment at all because they are fine. And they, plan to expand public investment in line with the Draghi recommendations, in some cases by quite a lot. No country wants to do it by 1% of its GDP, which is sort of the Draghi benchmark, but at least, that we are talking about 0.5, or in the case of the Netherlands, even more as a share of GDP. But then we have a whole bunch of countries. Romania is the most extreme case, Estonia for idiosyncratic reasons, but if you stay on this cloud of points to the upper right, there are essentially the countries that have large debts or large deficits that are planning to adjust quite a lot, and they plan to cut investment. So we are essentially in the same world as we were during the European crisis, which is that when you need to consolidate, public investment is the victim. The second problem with the European Commission approach is, of course, if you are basing industrial policy on national funding, you are creating a level playing field problem, right? And as you know, for this reason, state aid is prohibited in the European treaties, but there are exceptions. So essentially, when it's really good for the economy and possibly for Europe as a whole, you can do it. And so the plan is to expand the state aid framework to become more permissive to national subsidies. And then, and this is sort of a good idea by the Commission, that's also in their big plan, the competitiveness compass, is to create a coordination framework to make sure that national state aid is consistent with European industrial policy objectives. So this is what the so-called competitiveness coordination tool. So you can view it as sort of an informal institution or a mechanism where, countries talk to the Commission, get agreement on common European priorities, and then align their national industrial policies in line with these priorities. And to support this, the Commission would spend a bit of money, essentially creating financial incentives for member states to do that. And of course, if countries really don't cooperate, they have the original state aid rules in the back of their pocket. So there is also, in a sense, a stick that if countries do not if you want to spend on objectives that are good for Europe as a whole, you basically prohibit them from spending, right? So in principle, something like this can work. The problem with it is that even if it works perfectly, in the sense that national subsidies are aligned with European priorities, it is still true that German subsidies would only go to German firms, and Greek subsidies would only go to Greek firms. And so the level playing field problem is not resolved by this competitiveness coordination tool. Okay, and then the final concern is that while I very much appreciate what the European Commission is trying to do on defense, I think, and my co-authors, because we have recently published yesterday a paper on this, that this effort is not sufficient. So this is my last slide. Actually, the penultimate slide. So why is it not sufficient? Well, think of what European defense cooperation should aim for. So the first condition, I'm saying this partly because I'm in Norway, otherwise I would have maybe listed this third, okay? But it would still be on the same slide, is that defense cooperation should go beyond the EU, because the European Defense Club should include everyone that's threatened by Putin and has the same societal model. Now, the really critical thing that defense cooperation should aim for is to create a defense single market within the European Defense Club. And what that means is that, procuring authorities, states, should not discriminate against defense suppliers that are not national, as long as they are within the club. Now, why is this so critical? It is so critical because we are about to see a very large expansion in defense spending, so particularly in my own country, in Germany, in a market structure which is completely fragmented along national lines. So the European defense market is run by sort of mid-sized defense companies. So we have quite a few. Out of the 100 largest defense companies, 27 are located in Europe. but even the top ones are smaller than the top 3 in the US, but they mostly serve their national markets. So there's huge home bias and procurement. Now imagine what happens if you tender twice of the amount of money that you usually tender. You ask for twice the amount of armaments with the same national supply side. You're just going to raise prices. So the defense companies are going to become immensely rich, and the supply response will be slow and expensive. And so the only way of changing that is to generate competition. And the only way you can generate competition is to create a single market, because then you have the national champions of France, Germany, the UK, and other countries compete against each other. Plus, it's much more attractive for new entrants to come in, because they can then sell to the entire European market. All right? So the second point is by far the most important point. You should also have joint procurement, because that way you increase the market power on the buyer side, which gets you better prices, and also you increase scale, which drives down unit costs. So again, from a cost perspective, the really two important ones are 2 and 3. You will want to, at this point, complement so that you can possibly in the future substitute defense assets which are very large and complicated and difficult to build and currently are supplied exclusively by the United States. So we will have to build some of these so-called strategic enablers, like a European air defense, military satellites, possibly a new generation fighter, without relying on the United States. I think the US would be okay with this, as long as they fit within the overall NATO framework, but it gives us an option to replace defense assets from the US if the US is nasty to us, as they are being right now. And the only way you can do that, because this is so expensive, so large scale, is through common funding. Right? There needs to be a common fiscal effort. And finally, both for incentives reasons and for fairness reasons, there should be some burden sharing with frontline countries. So if you see on this chart, it gives you a correlation between the distance from Moscow, from the national capitals in Europe, and how much they spend. So you see a very clear inverse correlation. So countries that are closer closer to Moscow tend to spend more, but then you see a few data points which are sort of really off the charts. It's Poland, Estonia, Latvia, they spend disproportionately more. And now the main point is that the current and expanded EU mechanisms can go some way to solving these problems, but they cannot go all the way, because they cannot include non-EU members on an equal footing. Common funding is not in the cards because it requires unanimity in the EU, which we will not get for that. And very importantly, the European Treaty expressly excludes defense from the common market. And we cannot change the European Treaty. Again, we would need unanimity. It's impossible. So what's the solution? So we wrote a paper that was published yesterday where we call for a new institution, which we call the European Defense Mechanism, an analogy to the European Stability Mechanism, based on intergovernmental treaty. And so membership would be open to any European democracy. The governance would work like in any international organization. So you put in some capital, and then your voting shares are proportional to that capital. Presumably the capital is proportional to GDP and possibly to the size of military spending. And so the idea would be to plan and procure jointly, to have joint planning and potentially ownership of strategic enablers, as well as stockpiles of armaments, to fund this through the issuance of bonds in capital markets. And then the revenue stream that backs these bonds are essentially payments from members, either as a service charge for the common strategic enablers or as procured armaments are delivered. And the most important bit is that the membership obligation includes no national procurement in pre-specified joint areas and no discrimination against defense industries from other countries. So essentially, you're signing up to this club by committing yourselves to a tighter set of single market rules than you have in the EU treaties. What is the sweetener? The sweetener is that for the purposes of building these common strategic enablers, you do not issue your own debt. You need to issue some debt to capitalize the institution, but the big common defense asset would stay on the books. They would be owned by this common structure, and so the debt would also stay on the books, and that might make it affordable. So I'm out of time. I hope I gave you a good overview. I'm really sorry I can't take questions because we have the big highlight now. But it was great to meet you, and perhaps I will see some of you outside and we can talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.